trial for the former Idaho State Police trooper accused of killing his wife 3 years ago started this afternoon. Daniel Howard was arrested for his wife Kendi's murder last spring and is currently out on bond.
Have you ever wondered what it could be like to be responsible for the death of someone you love? I mean, actually being there and being the one to take the life of the person you claim to be in love with and want to spend the rest of your days with. Well, for State Trooper Daniel Howard, this wasn't just an imagination. Apparently, this man did it. And although the case is still very much in the courts, the evidence that has been provided by both sides has been pretty damning. So how did we get here? And what is the trial looking like? Join us as we take a full recap into the trial of Idaho State Trooper Daniel Howard. Crimes of passion are especially hard to dissect, mostly because of the emotions that usually go into them. And because they're so emotional, many of these crimes tend to be particularly brutal. This particular case goes back to February 2nd, 2021, when Kendi Howard, a 48-year-old woman, was found dead in the bathtub of a home that she owned with her estranged husband, Daniel. She had gunshot wounds to her head, and she was pretty much just laying there, dead in a pool of her own blood. According to reports, Daniel himself was the one who found Kendi's lifeless body. Brooke Wilkins, the couple's daughter, told news reporters that her father had simply called her and told her that there had been an accident.
What did he say?
That there had been an accident. Yes.
And she was gone.
He didn't even tell me that. He just said that she shot herself.
Initially, everyone thought that Kendi had truly committed suicide. But as the case went on, prosecutors started to believe that there might have been a little more to the case than just a person wanting to take her own life. Now you might be asking yourself, what could have happened here? Well, as it turns out, Kendi and Daniel had already been estranged. We mentioned that earlier. The couple already reached the end of their marriage, and they were getting ready to finalize their divorce proceedings. The theory goes that Daniel, who was already a retired state trooper in Idaho at the time, was probably looking to secure his financial future. And given that the couple had about $2 million in assets carefully stacked up, Kendi would have been entitled to a significant portion of that if the divorce went through. So, Daniel, looking to seemingly take out the competition, had some form of motive to kill his estranged wife and pocket all of that settlement money. To make things worse, Daniel himself already had a bit of a violent history. Reports confirmed that back in July 2020, he had assaulted Kendi, leading him to get a domestic battery charge. At the same time, Daniel's history as a state trooper hasn't exactly been spotless. Back in 2014, he was suspended and forced to resign from the Idaho State Police after he was hit with multiple charges, including grand theft, both in Kootenai and Bonner counties. And in 2015, he was given a suspended sentence of 3 years in prison and placed on probation after being ordered to serve 120 days in jail and perform over 600 hours of community service. This was after he was said to have harassed and threatened to kill his wife's alleged lover, as well as stealing ammunition from the Idaho State Police. With such a history of violence, you can imagine that a lot of people would have believed that Daniel was really the one behind Kendi's death. And after much back and forth, he finally surrendered himself to authorities in April 2023, a full 2 years after the incident in question had happened. So now that we understand the background to the case and what appears to have happened, let's take a look at some of the opening statements, as well as the witnesses called and the arguments that were made.
On February 2nd of 2021, did you become involved in the case involving Dan Howard?
Yes, I did.
Is he here today?
Yes, he is. So I'm here on this particular drawing. You go upstairs to the residence. To the left are a couple of bedrooms. To the right is the master or primary bedroom with its own separate bathroom. And directly above the stairs going up is the empty bathroom.
Were you there when he called family members?
Yes, I was not there for the initial first, I believe, two, but I did witness and observe at least one of them.
Which one was that?
That would have been with his stepdaughter, Brooke.
When he called Brooke, were you there?
No, I believe he was downstairs with Detective White at that time.
When she called Dan back, were you there?
Yes, I was.
And were you there to hear whatever you could hear over the phone from her?
I could hear it from across the room.
And were you there to hear his responses?
Yes, I was.
Who spoke first when she called Dan?
I don't recall who spoke first. I believe it was probably his stepdaughter.
Can you describe the conversation for us to the best of your memory?
She was angry, she was upset, and she immediately accused Dan of killing her mother.
And were you working as a dispatcher on July 10th, 2020?
Yes. Okay, I'm getting help. Okay, stay on the line for me, okay? Hold on. When did this happen? When did you hear the gunshot? What race? What race is he? Stay calm. Dan Howard. Okay, well, you said he's white. How old is he? 57. 57. What's he wearing? Take a breath. You were arguing with him. What shirt was he wearing? I don't know. Okay. Any green? Okay. Clear green. Okay. You're doing great. Okay, I need you to take a breath again. Okay, I know you're scared, but what is his name? Ken? Dan, and what's his last name? Howard.
The testimonies definitely aren't in Daniel's favor here. From the sketch of the house to the recordings of the 911 call, it does seem like two things are sure. Daniel is a man who apparently has a bit of a violent history, and he definitely knew his way around the house. Experts also pointed out the fact that if this entire thing was staged, it sure wasn't staged in favor of Daniel. Besides all of this, there is also the fact that Brooke, the couple's daughter, immediately believed that Daniel was the one who committed the crime as soon as he called her, something which she alluded to in both interviews and in her official statement to the court. Away from all the conjectures, we should also point out a few things that were found at the scene of the crime. So as we pointed out earlier, Kendy's lifeless body was actually found in her bathtub. However, investigators also discovered that her purse had been just beside her in the bathtub. At the same time, she was said to have made her nails and was really put together. If a person was really suicidal and was ready to end it all, would they look well and put together? It sure doesn't seem so. And then there's the smoking gun. The fact that the examiner who was in charge of Kendy's body confirmed that she couldn't possibly have killed herself. According to the examiner's report, Kendy must have died of asphyxiation before the gunshot wound was inflicted on her. So when you combine everything, the fact that Kendy seemed to be happy with her life amid the divorce, the fact that Daniel had a history of violence and knew his way around the house, and the fact that even the medical examiner concluded that Kendy couldn't have died of a gunshot wound, you really see why it's a bit skeptical to believe that Daniel must have been innocent here. As part of the opening remarks, the prosecution also got Kendy's new boyfriend, Daniel Prado. Prado and Kendy had actually been seeing each other for a while, and it is believed that the affair between them was one of the major reasons why her marriage to her husband finally hit the rocks. With the couple now headed for divorce, Kendy and Prado continued their affair, and before her untimely passing, she seemed ready to move on and settle with her new man. On the stand, Perpetrator spoke about a scary incident that happened just a few days before Kendy's passing.
Who was that phone call from?
Kendi.
When you answered the phone, what did you hear?
A lot of like a very distraught, panicked Kendi. It was like an open line. She wasn't talking to me, but it was an open line.
What did you hear on that open line?
She was very distraught, emotional. She was saying, "What are you doing? I'm just trying to go to the bathroom," and I could hear Dan on the call, and she was saying, "Let me close the door, let me close the door." And he was like, "Who are you talking to?" And she's like, "Nobody, I'm not talking to anybody. Why do you have your phone?" Then you can hear like a couple of thuds to where, it was like she was trying to close the door, and he wouldn't allow her to close the door, and she's like, "Let me close the door, let me close the door."
Approximately how long was this open line?
Approximately 15 seconds or so.
Was what you heard in that 15 seconds, that caused an emotional response in you?
Absolutely, I can tell the fear and panic in her voice.
What did you do?
I immediately hung up. Once I kind of figured out what was going on, I called her parents on the telephone and told them that you need to call Kendi immediately because there's something going on.
Approximately what time of the morning was this?
Between 4 and 5 a.m., somewhere in there.
Why didn't you call Kendi back?
I didn't want for Mr. Howard to see me, calling her and agitating him more, or, make it worse for Kendi because I knew she was in trouble.
In that second call, did Kendi Howard tell you what happened?
She did.
What did Kendi tell you happened?
She said that she was sleeping and something just startled her, and she woke up. And when she woke up, Mr. Howard was standing over her, and he was, wearing all dark clothing, gloves, and had a look about him that she said basically when he was looking at me, he was looking right through me. And she told me that she felt that Mr. Howard was going to kill her.
Perpetrator's testimony further cemented the notion that Daniel Howard had indeed been a violent person who still held a grudge that Kendi had cheated on him. And if you recall, Perpetrator himself had apparently been at the receiving end of some of the defendant's own aggression and harassment. Now, all of this might seem damning enough, but there's actually an interesting wrench in the works coming soon. So you remember the original medical examiner who claimed that Kendi couldn't possibly have died from the gunshot wound? Well, as it turns out, this examiner, whose name was given as Dr. John Howard, wasn't actually called as a state's witness. Instead, the examiner who was in fact called, her name being Dr. Jennifer Nara, actually came on the stand to declare that the initial examiner's report was actually flawed.
I was an associate medical examiner at the Spokane County office, and the doctors, we had a rotation of when we were assigned to do autopsies that day, and if there was a case that came in from an outside county such as Kootenai County, then we would be up for performing autopsies for that county.
So did Spokane County employ multiple doctors?
Yes.
Do you recall how many worked there at the time that you were there?
When I started there, I was the third doctor, so there were 2 other pathologists working there.
And did that change before you left?
Yes, it did.
How did that change?
The 2 doctors that were there, they both retired.
And did they subsequently hire new doctors to fill those positions?
Yes.
When you worked at the Spokane County Medical Examiner's Office, did you work with a doctor by the name of John Howard?
Yes, I did.
How
long did you work with John Howard?
I believe I overlapped with Dr. John Howard for about a year.
Was he one of the two doctors that was there when you started?
Yes.
And so would he be one of the doctors that was there when you left? Or excuse me, was he one of the two doctors that left while you were still there?
That's right.
During the year that you worked with Dr. John Howard, did you have observation, the ability to observe his work?
I did.
How would you describe John Howard's work when you first began working with him?
Dr. John Howard, he had an overall quiet demeanor. He came in every day and he reviewed his cases and he did his autopsies. Since I was new to the office, if I had any questions regarding policies or protocol, I would reach out to him and he was always willing to answer my questions.
Did you have opportunities to observe his autopsies?
I have observed a few of his autopsies.
Did you have opportunities to interact with John Howard towards the end of his career before he retired?
Yes, I did.
Was there a change in his demeanor from the times that you met him in the beginning to when you worked with him at the end?
I don't know if it was so much a big change. I knew even from the beginning, and it was something Dr. John Howard didn't hide. He had been working, close to 30 years, so he was pretty much ready to retire, and he loved to talk about how he was ready to retire.
Are you aware that there was an autopsy performed on an individual by the name of Kendi Howard in February of 2021?
Yes.
Are you aware approximately when John Howard left the Spokane County Medical Examiner's office?
Objection, Rowlands. Response?
Not without giving a speaking objection, Judge. I'm happy to.
Will approach? Sure.
Recall approximately when John Howard retired.
I believe it was in the summer of 2021, 2022. Sorry, I'm trying to remember what, I started in 2020 in Spokane, so it was a year later, 2021, it was the summer.
Getting back to the autopsy of Kendi Howard, you are aware that Kendi Howard was sent to the Spokane County Medical Examiner's office for an autopsy, correct?
Yes.
You were not the person who performed that autopsy, correct?
Correct.
Who performed that autopsy?
It was Dr. John Howard.
Did you have an opportunity to review that report?
Yes, I have.
Where did that autopsy take place?
That took place at the Spokane County Medical Examiner's office.
Do you recall the specific date that it took place?
Dr. John Howard performed the autopsy on February 3rd, 2021. That was the day after she was deceased.
We talk about the injury to the head. Was a wound documented that was not readily able to be seen in those pictures?
A wound documented in the head that I knew from reviewing the autopsy?
Yes.
Yes, so we saw there was a bruising to the tip of the tongue. So inside the mouth, there is an intraoral gunshot wound.
Can you describe how that intraoral gunshot wound went through the mouth?
Sure, so the bullet traveled through the tongue. It traveled into the pharynx, which is the tube in the back of your throat to help you breathe and digest. It goes through C2, which is your second cervical spine in your neck, went through the spinal cord in your neck, and then the bullet came to rest in the soft tissues in the back of the neck.
To really drive her point home, Dr. Nara went through some of the evidence that she found, which she believes made her point that the initial medical examiner's report might have been inaccurate.
Through the second cervical vertebrae, it's going in a slightly downward direction.
Have you can sit back down. Have you ever reviewed any literature or had any experience with intraoral gunshot trajectory?
Yes.
Objection. Maybe you can clarify.
Have you ever reviewed medical literature on trajectory in intraoral gunshot wounds?
Yes, I have.
Have you also had personal experience in autopsies involving intraoral gunshot wounds and determining trajectory?
Yes.
What does the, are there any, let me phrase it this way. Are downward trajectories associated with a particular manner of death?
It's not, it doesn't have a direct association, but in the literature and also from experience, we see a downward trajectory more often in non-suicides.
And when you say not suicides, do you mean homicides?
Homicide, yes.
What about an upward trajectory?
So in general, suicide, intraoral gunshot wounds, the majority of them are in an upward direction. Some of them go in a horizontal direction or parallel to the horizontal plane. And in the literature, they did document maybe like one or a couple cases where it does go in a downward, but the vast majority of suicide cases go in an upward direction.
In your personal experience, have you ever performed an autopsy involving a downward trajectory where the manner of death is determined to be suicide?
In a suicide, I personally have not observed a downward direction.
Did you ever personally have the opportunity to observe parts of Kenny Howard's body?
Yes.
How did that come to occur?
So I think that was really bad with dates. It's when I was first asked to review Dr. John Howard's report. I had asked, because there was a question of whether this was a suicide versus homicide, and I know the bullet went through the tongue. I was actually half joking when I asked did he happen to save the tongue, because I've never heard of anyone saving the tongue in an alleged suicide case, and the answer was yes. So I was still employed at the Spokane Medical Examiners at that time, so we pulled out the specimen jar. So on everybody we autopsy, we'll take biopsy sections of organs in case we need to go back and take additional sections to look under the microscope, and so they're saved in a specimen stock jar in formalin as a preservative. So in that jar was the tongue, and I had the opportunity to look at it at the time.
Dr. Noah, how unusual was it that John Howard saved the tongue?
I thought it was extremely unusual.
And just to clarify, are we talking about a sectional biopsy of the tongue, or are we talking about the entire tongue?
Dr. John Howard saved the entire tongue.
Did he save any other part of her body?
Just the usual biopsy sections of other organs, but no other organ in its entirety, except for the tongue.
In your over 4,000 autopsies that you've performed, have you ever saved the tongue?
The only time I saved the tongue was in someone who had really bad cancer that was blocking their airway and involved the tongue, and I basically took out the tongue and the whole upper airway just so we could see how bad the cancer was.
And nothing like this before?
No, nothing like this.
So, timeline-wise, you were asked to review this case, correct?
Yes.
And you said that was when exactly?
It would have been, say, 2021 was when I first, 2022, sorry, was when I first took a look.
And it's at that time that you retrieved the tongue?
Yes.
And when you retrieved it, it had been preserved, you stated?
Yes, it was preserved in formalin.
What did you do with it when you retrieved it?
So anytime you save tissue in formalin, it's a great preservative, but if you have an organ that's soft, such as the tongue or the stomach, it's going to curl up, even after a day in the preservative. So the tongue, also secondary to the injury, had become like misshapen. So I had to take several pins to pretty much put it back together so we could see the tongue in its original form as best as possible.
Were you able to pin it back in such a way that you were able to study it and observe it?
Yes.
Did you at that time document what you were doing?
Yes.
Did you do that through photographs?
Yes, we took several photographs.
Which one person witness?
You may.
Dr. Nar, I'm going to show you what's been marked as 21A through H. Do you recognize these photos?
Yes, I do.
What do you recognize these to be?
This is the tongue that I examined.
These are your photographs?
These were the photographs that the autopsy technician took at my direction.
And these accurately depict the tongue as you saw it on that day?
Yes.
What does 21H depict?
21H is a cassette that we submit to the laboratory. I went ahead and took a biopsy section of the top of the tongue just so I could look at it under the microscope.
And at the time I moved to admit that series of photographs.
Any objection? On your own. They were admitted.
Dr. Naro, what observations were you able to make about the tongue at that point in time?
That there was, the tongue has sustained significant injury.
Can you describe that injury?
It basically looked like a torpedo had gone through the tongue. It was like from the front to the back. It was completely torn up.
So, did examining the tongue at that level allow you to look at a wound path?
Yes.
Were you able to see where on the tongue the bullet entered?
Yes.
And was that top, bottom, middle, tip of the tongue?
It looked like it was towards the front of the tongue on the top.
And then did the bullet actually travel through the tongue itself?
Yes.
Were you able to make any observations about contact between the shot and the tongue?
Yes, given that there's presence of soot, which is the burnt gunpowder deposited on whatever surface it touches, there was definitely some soot on the tongue, so it's evidence of a contact gunshot wound.
What is hemorrhaging?
Hemorrhaging is essentially bleeding.
Were you able to make any conclusions regarding hemorrhaging to the tongue?
Yes.
How did you go about doing that?
So looking at the tongue just grossly or with the naked eye, I was looking for any evidence of hemorrhaging. Anytime an organ is fixed in the preservative formalin, blood tends to have more of a brownish discoloration. That's just what happens as it gets preserved. And I did notice there was some of that in the tongue. And I was also able to observe that under the microscope as well, that there was some hemorrhage.
Was the hemorrhaging you observed consistent with what you would expect of an injury that occurred before death?
The tongue is a very vascular organ. There's a lot of blood vessels. I mean, if you bit your tongue before, it just bleeds a lot. So an injury like that, where it's almost completely torn up, you would expect it to be bleeding a whole lot. And when I looked at the tongue, it didn't look like there was a whole lot of hemorrhage as I would have expected.
Essentially, Dr. Nara is of the strong belief that Daniel couldn't have been the one to kill Kendi, especially considering that the evidence shows that she appears to have indeed died from the gunshot wound. Her argument rested on the fact that Kendi's tongue, which was expected to have taken a significant amount of a hit after being directly in the contact of the bullet, didn't necessarily bleed so much. And considering the fact that the human tongue is an incredibly vascular organ with a lot of blood vessels, this seems to be a bit of a suspicious phenomenon. Want to know an additional doozy? Forensic reports also discovered that none of Daniel's DNA was discovered on the firearm in question. So could it be that the initial examiner who initially performed the test didn't get things right? Well, according to another forensic expert who was called as a witness for the state, the evidence available here tells a story that doesn't necessarily exonerate Daniel.
So with the vascular neck restraint, is it possible to utilize that and render someone unconscious, and if you keep it up long enough, kill them?
Absolutely. And what's interesting about Bicep and forearm is you'll have no marks on the neck, no bruising on the neck, because bruising is ruptured blood vessels, but because it's a broad surface, Bicep and forearm, they're broad surface. If you ask police officers who've gone through that training, at the end of the day, we had no marks on our neck. None.
And that was my next question, whether or not a vascular neck restraint would leave any marks. And I take it then by your video and your other literature here, there could be no particular hemorrhage either?
That's correct.
And going back to Dr. Nara and the tongue, specifically, what was it about what Dr. Nara did with the tongue and or her findings about the tongue that was important to you?
Several things. One, the analysis in that section of the tongue wasn't done at the first autopsy by Dr. Howard, but because for whatever reason Dr. Howard saved the tongue, she was able to go back and actually figure out the path of the bullet through the tongue. And the path of the bullet in this case is very important. And what she documented, photographed, and then wrote up is that the bullet path through the tongue is downward. Meaning going from the top of the tongue, through the tongue, out the bottom of the tongue, and then into the neck.
Based upon what you saw in terms of the evidence on her body with her broken jaw, her burn, all these blunt force trauma injuries to her person from her head to her toes, did you develop an opinion about whether or not this was a suicide or a homicide?
Yes, sir, I did.
And what is your opinion?
Miss Howard died of homicide. She, based on lots of stuff, the angle, the bullet path going into her mouth, the fact that she has 30 areas of blunt force trauma all over her body, there was clearly a struggle at some point. The fact that she sustained secondary burns to her forearm before her death. Why would you get into a hot bathtub if you have burns? Because your pain level is going to go through the roof. That just doesn't make sense. And then there are other issues, but the reason I think this is homicide, meaning death, someone caused her death, there were injuries that occurred before she died because of the bruising that you see, the pattern imprints that you see. And then there was an injury that occurred, I believe, after she was already dead. When you have an injury to your mouth, you bleed like stink. The tongue is so well vascularized, meaning there's lots of arteries that go to it. You get an injury to your tongue, you're going to bleed. And what was interesting at autopsy, Ms. Howard had no blood in her stomach and no blood in her lungs. So why is that? It's because she was already dead when she was shot in the mouth.
At the moment, it's a fight to determine what the facts of the case really say. Daniel Howard's defense lawyers have already brought out some pretty damning arguments, including the fact that Kendi appeared to have been living a double life before she passed away. Nevertheless, the state remains steadfast in its assertion that Daniel indeed was desperate to keep the couple's assets to himself and had a reasonable cause to go after his wife and do her physical harm. The trial for Daniel Howard is still very much ongoing. Both sides are still sharing their evidence and calling witnesses, and it looks like more of this trial will drag on for a bit. Would there be more evidence to drop? Is anyone hiding a smoking gun and is just waiting for the perfect time to enter it into the record? Time will tell. As we unravel the mysteries of true crime, your support drives us forward. Remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay with us as we delve into the darkest corners of true crime. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and keep chasing cases.